Look around you. The palaces of Europe and Russia, Versailles, Peterhof, the Hermitage, are hymns to human genius. The gold is blinding, the architecture seems to defy gravity itself, and the intricate hydraulic systems are simply astonishing. But hidden within this dazzling portrait of monumental grandeur is one tiny yet incredibly inconvenient detail that is about to shatter your worldview. We've been told all our lives about the magnificence of the Enlightenment, the brilliance of monarchs, and the talent of architects. But scratch away the guilt from the official history, and an uncomfortable, pungent truth is revealed. How is it possible that a civilization capable of building multi-million-ton palaces and creating complex hydro-engineering structures, fountains soaring dozens of meters without a single electric pump, could have forgotten to build toilets? Stop for a second and imagine yourself in 15th or 18th century Versailles. You are walking through the Hall of Mirrors. Silk, velvet, and powdered wigs surround you, and all this splendor is accompanied by a persistent, sickening stench. Historians blushingly look away and mumble something about different customs. They assure us that the European elite simply didn't like to cleanse themselves, that aristocrats relieved themselves directly behind thick curtains in the corridors, or used portable chamber pots, the contents of which they shamelessly flung out the windows. They try to sell us the version that the greatest architects of the era, who calculated the stress on domes with jeweler's precision, designed the unique acoustics of immense halls, and masterfully controlled the element of water, simply couldn't figure out how to lay a basic ceramic pipe for wastewater. Do you truly believe this technological oxymoron? Look at Peterhof. Look at Versailles. They are true hymns to hydro-engineering. These are systems of communicating vessels, storage reservoirs, sluices, and cascades where water is delivered from tens of kilometers away under tremendous pressure to create a spectacular spray that leaps into the sky. Engineers, according to the official narrative, knew the laws of hydraulics better than modern technical university graduates. And these same engineering geniuses, we are told, could not manage to build a simple floor slope and run a pipe out to a cesspit outside the palace? This isn't just illogical, it's impossible. It contradicts every logic of technological development. If you can build the Samson tearing the jaws of the lion fountain, from whose mouth a column of water shoots 20 meters high, creating a sewage system is a kindergarten-level task. Here lies not just a historical inaccuracy, but a terrible secret that museum curators prefer to keep silent. What if they didn't build these palaces? What if those we call great monarchs and emperors were merely occupants? Imagine a group of people with primitive knowledge finding an abandoned modern skyscraper. They go inside, they see the elevators but don't know how they work, so they use them as storage closets. They see the commodes but don't understand their purpose and start leaving their biological byproducts right in the corridors because the complex drainage system is off, damaged, and they don't know how to repair it. This is precisely what we seem to be witnessing in the history of the 18th and 19th centuries. We see the primitive use of high-tech objects inherited from a previous, far more advanced civilization. In anthropology, this phenomenon is called a cargo cult. Our ancestors, or those who are presented as such, acted more cunningly. They moved into the stone masterpieces, cleared them of dirt and sediment, but failed to restore the crucial functionality. Palaces without private facilities are not a design flaw. They are direct evidence that the original purpose of these rooms was entirely different. Perhaps what we consider ballrooms were once technical floors or even power stations. Remember the Winter Palace, 1,057 rooms, 1945 windows, and not a single designated room for hygiene in the original plan. How is this possible? The imperial family, who possessed half the world, was forced to use chamber pots just like the most ordinary people. We are told that proper sewage only appeared in St. Petersburg in the second half of the 19th century, yet the granite embankments with perfectly fitted blocks, polygonal masonry, and those very fountains already existed. This is a technological oxymoron. Either you have the technology for stone processing and hydraulics, and thus you have sewage, plumbing, and heating, or you live in filth and squalor, but then you build mud and straw huts, not St. Isaac's Cathedral with its 114-ton columns. There is no third option. Historians try to sit on two chairs, telling us simultaneously about the empire's grandeur and its crudeness. But the truth is that we are, in all likelihood, merely parasitizing on the ruins of giants. What happened in the palaces of Europe was not culture, which implies cultivation, development, but genuine degradation. The invention of French perfumes was not for seduction, but to somehow mask the sickening smell of unwashed bodies and biological byproducts that permeated the velvet curtains. Kings who were said to bathe twice in their lives, at birth and before their wedding, demonstrated not different customs, but the behavior of people who had lost access to water for basic needs.
Do you feel this dissonance? There is water for a grandiose show, for a display of power in thousands of cubic meters per hour through the fountains, but there is none for washing the body. This means only one thing. The fountain system was working autonomously, perpetually. The new masters, the occupants, simply could not redirect this flow into the bathing rooms because they were afraid of breaking what was not built by them. They came into pre-existing buildings. They saw pipes disappearing into the walls but didn't know where they led. They saw openings that we would now mistake for ventilation or technical shafts, and they bricked them up because of the draft. They blocked the unique air heating systems with fireplaces because they didn't know how to start them. We live in a world where history has been rewritten by the winners. But these winners were, in essence, barbarians who seized a massive planetary-scale Rome. And the next time you look at a palace's luxurious facade, remember, behind that facade hides the secret of people who relieved themselves behind a curtain because they forgot how to use the legacy of the previous builders. But the lack of private facilities is just the beginning. If you think that is the strangest part, wait until we delve into the technical details that would make any sane engineer's hair stand on end. Official science claims that the Peterhof fountain system is a marvel of 18th century hydroengineering created solely by the power of gravity. We're told that water was collected from the Ropsha heights and flowed by gravity through canals and pipes to create the pressure capable of lifting Samson's stream 21 meters high. It sounds beautiful until you start calculating. To ensure the continuous operation of such a complex, you need more than just ditches dug by serfs with shovels. You need the ideal slope calculated down to the millimeter per kilometer. One mistake, and the water will either stagnate or tear the pipes apart in the lowlands. And here we face the first impossible artifact, the quality of the pipes. During the restoration of old systems, fragments of pipelines are often found whose casting quality surpasses many modern counterparts. These are pipes perfectly smooth inside, often with flanged connections, manufactured with technologies lost for centuries. How, tell me, does a civilization that cannot organize the production of ceramic commodes and sewage drains in an imperial palace cast kilometers of high-strength cast-iron pipes capable of withstanding colossal pressure? That's like finding a Ferrari engine in a horse-drawn cart. The contrast between the technology for supplying water to the fountains and the complete lack of technology for draining wastewater from the living quarters is not merely a peculiarity. It is proof that the fountains and the palaces were not built by the people who later inhabited them. Now shift your gaze from the fountains to the buildings themselves. Look at the lower floors of the Winter Palace, St. Michael's Castle, or any old building in the center of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Paris, or Rome. What do you see? Windows sticking out from under the asphalt, Half the window looks out onto the street. Half looks underground. Historians call this the cultural layer. They explain to us that over 200, 300 years, people carried so much dirt on the soles of their shoes, and street cleaners did such a poor job that the ground level rose by 3 or even 5 meters. Think about this absurdity. 3 meters of dirt is the height of a single-story house. If the official version is to be believed, our ancestors lived in a genuine pigsty where garbage was not removed for centuries but simply compacted, and new roads were built on top of the old ones. But as soon as you start excavating, this theory collapses into dust. When archaeologists or builders dig up the foundations of old buildings, they discover that these so-called basements have full-sized windows, doors, and even grand entrances that now lead into solid earth. Who in their right mind would design a window underground? Who would create beautiful brickwork, arches, and decorative elements where no one will ever see them because they are buried under the soil? The answer is obvious. These were the first floors. They were above ground. The buildings were taller. A catastrophe occurred, a global cataclysm that buried cities under a layer of clay and soil several meters deep. Researchers call this phenomenon the clay flood or the clay burial. And this finally explains the peculiarities with the sewage. Imagine you have a high-tech house, but the first 2 floors, where all the technical nodes, purification systems, and sewage were located, are now buried under a thick layer of earth. You, the survivors or the arriving occupants, only occupy the upper floors that survived. You don't have the technology to dig up the city. You simply level the ground to the height of the 3rd floor, turn windows into doors, and start living. But the facilities remained down there, beneath the multi-meter layer of clay. You can't reach them. The pipes are broken or clogged with soil. What are you left with? Using chamber pots and dumping the slops out the window, right onto that very cultural layer, which is actually evidence of a planetary catastrophe. Now look at old engravings and paintings by ruin artists like Piranesi or Hubert Robert. We are told these are the artist's fantasies, but why are these fantasies so photographically accurate? On them we see majestic but ruined and overgrown buildings, buried arches, and small people scurrying amongst the gigantic ruins, using them for their everyday needs. These people are cooking soup over a fire in the middle of a massive temple. They are drying laundry on the remnants of ancient columns. This is us. We are the civilization that arrived in the ashes. Let's continue our investigation by moving to the next incredible mystery that official history cannot explain: the mystery of heating. If we accept as a fact that the genius engineers of the 18th century capable of building the Peterhof fountain system could not lay a sewage pipe in the Winter Palace, the answer can only be one: they didn't build it. It is not their creation, but an inheritance they received from someone who possessed an immeasurably higher level of technology. We must look at the great monarchies of Europe and Russia not as creators, but as occupants. Imagine a world after a global upheaval where a highly developed civilization has collapsed. Its cities remain, granite, majestic, colossal. And upon these ruins arrive survivors, or more likely newcomers with only basic knowledge. They see enormous stone palaces that still stand despite everything. They inhabit them, but don't understand how they work. This is the occupancy hypothesis. It explains not only the commode problem, but also another equally glaring architectural puzzle: heating. Look at the palaces of St. Petersburg and, for example, Versailles. Huge halls, 6-meter-high ceilings, windows comparable in size to the wall of a small apartment, and small, often decorative fireplaces that could only warm a tiny area around them.
We are told about the fierce Russian winters, about the Neva freezing over, and in these conditions, members of the imperial family, people who commanded colossal resources, were forced to live in halls where the temperature barely reached a comfortable level, wrapped in furs and heavy coats while inside their own palace. From the perspective of thermodynamics and elementary physics, this is suicidal. No amount of wood burned in those miniature fireplaces could have heated the multi-ton stone walls, let alone the airspace of the massive halls. This means that these buildings were originally not intended to be heated by open fire. They were part of a completely different, centralized heating system. Perhaps it was forced air heating, perhaps it was some form of geothermal or even free energy installation that provided a comfortable climate throughout the building, invisibly and without smoke. What we see today are the remnants. The stoves we call Dutch or Russian and the decorative fireplaces were installed post factum. This was the desperate attempt by the new masters to somehow adapt the freezing stone shells to the harsh realities of the North, using the primitive means available to them, burning wood. The barbaric logic emerges again. They come to a ready-made house. It doesn't work, they don't know how to fix it, and try to replace the complex high-tech system with a crude and smoky one that operates on principles they understand.
Such an aristocratic cargo cult can be traced everywhere. The palaces are built from ideal, complex materials, granite, marble, cast iron, but then inside we see primitive domestic arrangements. The use of a chamber pot against a backdrop of marble staircases is not a cultural feature, it is a necessity dictated by the technical inability to restore the function of the sanitary facility, which, as we recall, was buried under a multi-meter layer of cultural layer, the traces of a planetary catastrophe. The technological imbalance screams that the builders and the inhabitants are two different civilizations, separated in time. Now look closely at the scale of these structures, not only the 6-meter ceilings, but the giant, often inconveniently located doorways, the handles positioned above a modern person's elbow level, and the monumental staircases with incredibly high steps. Did the architects truly build so illogically, ignoring elementary ergonomics? Or was this architecture designed for a different physiology? For people or beings who were taller than us, for people who might look like giants to us. The legends of giants and titans found in the mythology of almost every nation cannot be merely coincidence. They may be the remnants of real memories of a previous race that inhabited this planet and whose palaces, temples, and homes we have now occupied. If they were taller, a 6-meter ceiling and high doorways would be normal ergonomics for them. And if, according to the legends, they sustained themselves on manna from heaven, prana, or something else that didn't leave significant byproducts, it perfectly explains the absence of private facilities in our usual understanding. Why would they need sewage for biological byproducts if their physiology perhaps didn't require the removal of large volumes of waste? We, the current inhabitants, with our primitive biology and need to consume dense food, moved into luxurious buildings ill-suited for our physiology. We were uncomfortable in them. We were cold because the heating system was disconnected, and we had nowhere to dispose of our biological byproducts. So what did the occupants do? They started remodeling. They bricked up unnecessary openings that were likely part of the ventilation or energy circuit. They broke walls to install stoves. Like vandals, they smashed holes in the floors or just poured waste out the windows because the complex infrastructure embedded in the buried floors was inaccessible to them. Thus, we see a world that is not being built, but inhabited after a catastrophe.
And this leads us to the next, even more frightening question. If the cities were the legacy of lost giants, and we are merely the new occupants who replaced them, then why are there so few people?
Where did the millions of builders and residents vanish to? And why do our cities look like empty sets waiting for actors in the oldest photographs? This question about the demographic crash and the deserted cities of the early 19th century will be the next step in our journey through the inconvenient truth that history conceals. We identified the great contradiction. The genius engineers of the 18th century, who we are told erected the palaces, could not cope with the elementary task of wastewater disposal. We introduced the occupancy theory, according to which the monarchs and their retinues were not builders but new inhabitants who inherited or seized the ruins of a highly developed civilization. Now we must move from the architectural anomaly to the technological one and prove that this gap in knowledge truly could not have existed within a single era. Let's start with that very miracle official history is so proud of, Peterhof. They constantly tell us that the fountain system, capable of lifting Samson over 20 meters high, works exclusively by the power of gravity. Water is collected in storage ponds on the Ropsha Heights and then flows by gravity through canals and pipes into the lower park. It sounds logical and beautiful, a triumph of human intellect over the elements. But this beauty melts like morning mist as soon as we apply the laws of physics. For this system to work perfectly and continuously, it was necessary to do more than just dig ditches. Incredible precision was needed in calculating the slopes over tens of kilometers. We are talking about an elevation difference that had to be maintained with millimeter accuracy to ensure the required flow velocity, prevent pipes from bursting in the lowlands from too much pressure, and ensure the reservoirs were filled at the height. Building such a system in a swampy area in the conditions of that time without modern surveying instruments and levels is a task that is barely feasible even today. For us, this is not just an architectural achievement, but an artifact of quality that does not correspond to the era in which it was supposedly created.
If you begin to examine the old pipelines that are sometimes uncovered during restoration, we face an even greater shock. Fragments of pipes are often found that look like impossible technology. These are perfectly smooth inside, high-strength cast iron or even steel pipes capable of withstanding colossal pressure. Their casting quality, strength, and the smoothness of the inner surface, critically important for reducing friction and maintaining pressure, point to a level of metallurgy that is far superior to what the artisanal factories of the Petrine or Catherine eras could have provided. It is like finding a perfectly polished, high-precision medical scalpel in a cave belonging to an ancient human. You immediately realize the cave person could not have made it. This is the technological gap. We have the Ferrari engine, ideal hydraulics and metallurgy for pipe production, and at the same time we have the cart, the inability to create basic plumbing and sewage for draining waste from the palaces. This contrast between colossal engineering achievements in water supply and complete primitivism in water removal proves that these two tasks were solved by different civilizations. Those who created the perfectly functioning autonomous fountains possessed technologies unknown to us. Those later came and lived in these palaces, the occupants, used the pipes of the fountains as intended for a spectacular show, but lacked the knowledge or resources to create their own primitive sewage system or restore what was buried. But water is not the only evidence of a technological gap. Let's return to the mystery of heating in the northern capital. St. Petersburg is a city with severe climate. Nevertheless, as we already mentioned, the palaces of the 18th-19th centuries have enormous windows and high 6-meter ceilings. This is not just inconvenient, it is irrational from the perspective of thermal conservation. Any thermal engineer will tell you that this is architectural madness if the only heat source is a small fireplace. Heating such volumes of stone masonry and air in the hall would require tons of wood daily, and the palaces would constantly have to be shrouded in smoke from chimney stacks. But engravings and descriptions show luxurious, clean interiors.
This leads us to the conclusion that the palaces were designed either for a different climate, which is unlikely, or for a different heating technology. It is entirely possible that they were equipped with complex forced air heating systems, or even more compellingly, utilized some form of free energy that allowed for the maintenance of a comfortable temperature without burning fuel or smoke. When this system was lost, as a result of that very catastrophe, the occupants, unable to restore it, began installing primitive stoves and fireplaces that essentially only simulated heating without fully achieving it. Tsars in furs in the Winter Palace are not a peculiarity, they are the logical consequence of their barbarian adaptation to the ruins. This technological gap, the presence of ultra-technologies, ideal hydro-engineering, pipe metallurgy, and the complete absence of elementary solutions, sanitary facilities, effective heating, completely demolishes the official version of sequential development. This is not evolution, it is regression. But where then did the geniuses who built all this disappear to? Where did the people who possessed such knowledge and resources go? After all, to build St. Petersburg, one needed not only to know how to cast pipes, but also to mobilize millions of people, provide them with housing, food, and logistics. And here we approach the next, perhaps most painful part of our story, the catastrophe that left entire cities empty, and the demographic crash that was concealed behind the myth of the orphans. The problem is not only with the architects, but also with the fact that the cities we moved into were buried, and this in turn explains where their millions of inhabitants vanished. Our investigation of the inconvenient facts has led us to the inevitable conclusion: the technological gap between the builders and the subsequent inhabitants of the grand palaces is too vast to be a coincidence. It points to a temporal void, a catastrophic moment that erased memory and destroyed the infrastructure. And the most significant proof of this catastrophe is not found on the pages of textbooks, but right beneath our feet, on the streets of any ancient city in the world. We are talking about the phenomenon of buried cities. If you live in Moscow, St. Petersburg, London, Paris, or Rome, just go outside and look at the facades of buildings constructed before the mid-19th century. On almost every one of them you will see the same anomaly. The first-floor windows are half and sometimes entirely underground. What should be a window has turned into a narrow slit level with the asphalt or sidewalk. Official science, as we already know, provides a ridiculous explanation for this phenomenon, the cultural layer. We are told that over 200–300 years, people carried so much dirt, dust, and debris that the ground level naturally rose by 2, 3, or even 5 meters.
Let's apply elementary logic and mathematics to this version. For the ground level in the city center to rise by 3 meters, it requires more than just neglecting to clean up the trash. It requires city authorities and residents to have consciously buried their streets with waste and soil for centuries, making no effort to remove it. We must imagine St. Petersburg drowning in manure and garbage, where every new house is built atop a 3-meter layer of dirt. This is not just unhygienic, it is a logistical and construction absurdity. How did transport function in this environment? How did markets operate? Why do old engravings depicting the city before the large-scale construction show clean, paved squares and roads? The absurdity of this theory reaches its peak when we start digging. When builders or archaeologists open up these basements, they do not find damp earthen floors and rough walls. They find full-fledged windows with arched tops and perfectly finished stone slopes, decorative masonry and architectural elements that would never have been designed for an invisible basement.
And the most shocking thing, grand doors and porches that today lead into a dead end under the earth. Who would spend colossal amounts of money, effort, and time on the decorative finishing of rooms that were initially planned to be buried? The answer is obvious. No one. These so-called basements are in fact the first and sometimes second floors of buildings that stood at ground level before some global catastrophe. The catastrophe we call the Clay Burial. The evidence points to a single, synchronous planetary event that occurred relatively recently, most likely in the 18th or early 19th century. This could have been anything: a planetary flood not of water but of mud flows, a pole shift, colossal mud eruptions from volcanoes, or, as some researchers suggest, the use of some geoclimatic weapon that led to the collapse of the upper atmosphere and the subsequent burial. As a result of this event, millions of tons of fine soil, clay, and sand fell onto the surface, instantly burying cities several meters deep. The clay and sand quickly hardened, preserving the lower parts of the buildings. This hypothesis instantly resolves all the mysteries we have discussed. The mystery of the sanitary facilities, sewage systems, plumbing nodes, and waste drains, all of this was always located on the lower floors. If these floors are buried, the infrastructure is destroyed and inaccessible. The occupants who arrived after the catastrophe and inhabited the surviving upper floors were physically unable to use or restore the complex system. All they could do was use primitive chamber pots and dump waste out the windows right onto that very cultural layer, the burial. The mystery of heating. Technical rooms, where the control nodes for the centralized heating system, or free energy, were possibly located, also went underground. The buildings became non-functional in terms of heating, which forced the new inhabitants to improvise by installing ineffective fireplaces. The mystery of logistics, the construction of St. Petersburg. If the city was not built but unearthed and restored, this resolves all questions about the impossibility of transporting millions of tons of granite through swamps in the 19th century. The granite embankments and columns were already standing there, covered by a multi-meter layer of dirt. Peter I, Catherine II, and other monarchs were engaged not so much in construction as in large-scale emergency restoration and cleaning of the surviving parts of the city, replacing damaged facades and adapting them to the new conditions. Thus, the majestic palaces are not the pride of our civilization. They are the tombstones of the previous one. They are not proof of our growth, but evidence of our occupancy on foreign land, in foreign homes after their former owners vanished. And this final fact, the disappearance of millions of inhabitants, is the most painful and carefully concealed part of this inconvenient truth. If the cities were buried, what happened to those who lived in them? This leads us to the shocking story of the demographic crash and the era of orphans that followed the catastrophe. We established the fact of a global catastrophe, the Clay Burial, that interred the lower floors of great cities and destroyed the infrastructure of the former highly developed civilization. Logically, such a planetary event could not have left the population untouched. So where did the millions of people who should have inhabited these perfectly designed granite cities go? The answer to this question is one of the most carefully concealed secrets of the 19th century, revealed in two shocking anomalies: the absolute emptiness in old photographs and the sudden appearance of millions of orphans. Look at the first daguerreotypes and photographs taken in the 1840s, 1850s, and even 1860s. Be it Paris, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Rome, or London, they resonate with total emptiness. In these images, we see majestic, monumental buildings, wide avenues, squares, but no people. There are no crowds, no street bustle, no carriages, no market trade, not even stray animals. The cities look like gigantic yet lifeless stage sets waiting for actors to begin the performance. The official explanation for this phenomenon is familiar to us: long exposure. we are told that due to primitive photographic technology, the exposure lasted several minutes, and therefore moving objects, including people and transport, simply disappeared from the frame. But even this explanation does not withstand criticism. If the exposure had indeed been long, we would see blurred, indistinct shadows due to the sun's movement.
Smeared water surfaces, which should be blurred like jelly. Ghostly figures, translucent silhouettes of people who stopped for at least a second. Instead, we see crystal clear shadows, perfectly still flags, and sometimes, if you look closely, very rare, frozen people, perhaps specially placed by the photographer or those who posed without moving for the entire exposure time. The conclusion is obvious. The cities were empty. They could not have been filled because there was no one to fill them. The former residents perished in the catastrophe. And it is precisely during this period, in the mid-19th century after the supposed clay burial, that a global demographic crash is observed, masked as the phenomenon of the era of orphans. Across the world, suddenly and inexplicably, millions of orphan children appear. Orphanages and shelters in Russia were filled to the limit. This was not just children losing parents to illness, it was a mass phenomenon. In the United States, there was the phenomenon of orphan trains, entire trains loaded with homeless children who were transported from overcrowded eastern cities to the west to be settled on farms. Millions of children without history, without lineage, literally unloaded from nowhere. The official version links this to industrialization, migration, and epidemics, but none of these reasons explain the massiveness, suddenness, and planetary scale of this phenomenon. Epidemics usually leave records and evidence of the mass placement of adults. Here, we see only children. This leads us to a shocking theory. We, the current population, are, for the most part, descendants of these orphans. We are a civilization of orphans, artificially settled in emptied cities. Imagine the elites who survived the catastrophe faced a problem. Enormous, valuable, but empty cities. People are needed to inhabit them and work. Where to find them? The answer: gather the surviving children, those who could not take shelter underground or were abandoned by their parents, raise them in the incubators of orphanages under strict control, give them new names, new surnames, and erased memories of the past. Settle them in the cities that were hastily cleared of the burial, unearthed. Such a massive reboot of civilization explains the short generational memory of most modern people. If you try to trace your lineage, you will find that the memory of ancestors often breaks off somewhere in the mid-19th century. Beyond that, emptiness. We do not know where our great-great-grandparents came from, who they were, or what they did. Before the 1850s, clear, continuous lineage. After the 1850s, collective amnesia. Consequently, we are not the descendants of those who built these granite palaces. We are occupants who were raised to master and inhabit a foreign inheritance.
This also explains the chaos in construction after the 1850s, when the occupants began to build their own buildings rather than unearthing old ones. It suddenly resembled primitive, clumsy construction. Crooked brick shacks appear next to perfectly fitted granite blocks. Technology sharply degrades. We had to reinvent the steam engine, the telegraph, and primitive sewage systems because the knowledge that allowed for the creation of fountains and ancient columns was lost along with the original civilization. And here we come to the logistical paradox that will force us to doubt the very possibility of St. Petersburg's construction within the stated timelines. Because if the cities were not built but unearthed, this explains all the logistical and manufacturing inconsistencies we see in the official history. We determined that the cities were empty, and their new inhabitants were the descendants of orphans who moved into the ruins after a global catastrophe. This brings us to the final and perhaps most convincing proof that the majestic cities were not built in the 18th, 19th centuries, but were unearthed and claimed. This is the logistical collapse of the official history of St. Petersburg's construction. The official version is a true epic about the heroic conquering of the swamp. We are told that a city of granite and marble was erected on a bare, swampy spot by the will of one man. But if we apply elementary logistical and resource analysis to this story, it falls apart like sand. The logistical impossibility, granite and swamp. St. Petersburg is a city standing on millions of tons of solid materials. Granite embankments, kilometers of embankments faced with perfectly fitted multi-ton granite blocks. Columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral, 48 monolithic columns, each weighing over 114 tons, which had to be delivered from quarries, loaded onto barges, transported, unloaded, lifted, and installed on marshy ground. Foundations. To prevent these colossal buildings from sinking into the swamp, millions of piles had to be driven. Ask yourself, how was this done? The official answer, by the efforts of serfs, horses, and primitive levers. Let's start with logistics. If the city were built from scratch, as they tell us, the delivery of such a quantity of building materials, granite, brick, wood, metal, would require an army of horses. Millions of tons of cargo would have to be transported by horse-drawn transport. It is estimated that this would require tens of thousands of horses working simultaneously in conditions of poor roads. Road capacity. Dirt roads, especially during rainy seasons, simply could not withstand such traffic. Horses and carts would sink in the mud.
The drowning city. The city would have drowned in manure. Tens of thousands of horses leave behind such a quantity of organic waste that without modern sanitation and a powerful cleaning system, the city would become uninhabitable in just a few years. Yet old engravings show us surprising cleanliness. Conclusion. It was logistically impossible to deliver and use such a quantity of solid material in such a short time using 18th-19th century technology. The resource collapse, the mystery of brick and wood. The problem is not just granite, but also brick. Billions of bricks were needed to build St. Petersburg. Where were the factories? Producing such a quantity of brick would require a huge number of brick factories, consuming an incredible amount of clay and fuel, wood. Where was the fuel? The forests in the vicinity of St. Petersburg would have to be completely cut down, and the surrounding environment turned into a scorched desert, smoky from thousands of firing kilns. Where was the clay? Quarries for clay extraction would have to tear up the surrounding area for hundreds of kilometers. There are no traces of such a gigantic, overworked industrial zone. There are only isolated small factories that could not possibly provide such volumes. The official version that Peter I or Catherine II built St. Petersburg fails the test of resource provision and logistics. The solution, not built, but unearthed. All these inconsistencies are resolved if we accept our central hypothesis. The cities were already standing. The granite and columns were delivered and installed by a previous civilization that possessed the technology to easily move monoliths. Peter I and his successors found the ruins of a city buried by the clay burial. Their activity consisted not of creation from scratch, but of large-scale restoration, cleaning, and claiming of this legacy. They unearthed the columns, for example, the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral, which were apparently already standing but were half buried, cleaned the granite embankments, and restored the surviving upper floors, presenting it as their own construction. This is the iPhone in the cave principle. The building exists, perfect and complex, but all the manufacturing base is missing. No factories, no logistics, no quarries, no fuel. This conclusively proves that the builders and the current inhabitants are two completely different entities. They found ideal cities designed on an unprecedented scale, and not understanding their true purpose, as we have already discussed, hydraulics without sewage, heating without firewood, began to adapt them to their primitive life. But what were these buildings originally built for? Why did the former civilization not require our understanding of hygiene? The answer lies in their possible different physiology and their incredible energetic and architectural purpose.
The logistical collapse of the official version of St. Petersburg's construction has convincingly proven that we are dealing with ready-made ruins. Only one global question remains, linking all the previous anomalies. Who was that original builder? And what was the true technological purpose of these grandiose cities? We need to return to the mystery that was at the very beginning. Palaces without sanitary facilities, with enormous doors and inconveniently high ceilings. This architectural style, which we call empire or neoclassicism, is actually architecture for giants. Different physiology and Gulliver's scale. Towering 6-meter ceilings, doors whose handles are at the chest or even face level of a modern person, and monumental steps that are difficult to climb. All of this is not a design flaw. It is perfect ergonomics, but for beings who were significantly taller than us. If the former inhabitants were 3 or 4 meters tall, these spaces would be just as comfortable and proportionate for them as a standard apartment is for us. We, the occupants, feel like insects in these palaces, because compared to them, we are a biologically smaller version. This also explains the universal sanitary facility problem. If this civilization was so technologically advanced that it mastered a different physiology or learned to process food with a minimal amount of byproducts, perhaps the mentioned nutrition on prana or another clean energy, they simply did not need our primitive sewage system. They could have had localized self-cleaning systems that had nothing to do with our cesspits. Thus, we, with our primitive biology, came into a building designed for a higher life form and faced a problem. We had nowhere to dispose of waste, and we were forced to resort to the most barbaric methods. But these buildings were not merely homes. They were part of something much larger, a single planetary energy system. Look at the repeating architectural elements. The domes of cathedrals and temples, St. Isaac's Cathedral, Kazan Cathedral, they are often covered in copper or gold leaf. A dome mounted on an insulating ring is very similar in shape and material to a capacitor. The spires and crosses on the tops are essentially antennas or receiving devices. The granite embankments and the ideal grid of streets could have been part of a resonance circuit or a kind of city printed circuit board that powered the system.
The theory suggests that these cities were designed to harvest free atmospheric energy. The fountains at Peterhof could have worked not only through gravity, but also by utilizing ambient pressure or some energy resonator that generated the force, with gravity being just part of the camouflage. The palaces and cathedrals could have been devices that converted energy for heating, lighting, and powering other city systems, including, perhaps, the very clean lifestyle of their inhabitants. When this planetary network was disrupted as a result of the catastrophe, the buildings lost their functionality and turned into freezing stone shells, as we saw with the example of heating. The War of the Titans and the traces of the cataclysm. Why did this civilization perish? Because such a global catastrophe as the clay burial could hardly be a random natural phenomenon. Many researchers point to traces of a war that preceded the demise. Perfectly round lakes. Across the world, especially in Russia and North America, are lakes with an almost perfect circular shape. The official version often links them to meteorites. However, they may be craters from powerful explosions used during a conflict. Melted fortresses. Some ancient fortresses and towers, for example in Scotland, show traces of melted stone, meaning they were exposed to incredibly high temperatures that cannot be achieved by ordinary fire or artillery. This suggests the use of weapons with a thermonuclear or similar energy principle. Star forts.
On maps from the 17th to 19th centuries, numerous fortresses shaped like multi-pointed stars are marked all over the world. These star forts are identical across all continents and look less like defensive structures and more like fractal antennas or nodes of a global energy network. The war was aimed at destroying this network. The catastrophe that buried the cities could have been a direct consequence of this war of the Titans, leading to climatic and geological shifts, the result of which was the very clay burial. Thus, we do not live in a civilization that is progressing, but in a civilization that has occupied a battlefield. We took over the ruins after a planetary conflict that wiped a highly developed race of giants and their perfect technological environment off the face of the Earth. One final step remained for the new masters of the world, not just to occupy the ruins, but to erase from the memory of all who survived the history of what was before them. This was achieved through total erasure of memory, contradictory fire, falsification, and cynical spectacles presented to us as progress.
Our journey through the ruins of a forgotten civilization has led us to the final point, the understanding that we, the current inhabitants, are occupants in foreign buried cities. We are the descendants of orphans who were given a new life and, most importantly, a new history. But for this lie to become absolute truth, the ruling elites after the catastrophe needed to commit an act of total memory erasure. This act consisted of two interconnected processes, the destruction of material evidence and the falsification of collective consciousness. The Forger's Eraser, the Cult of Fire. The most effective way to conceal a high-tech past is to destroy the blueprints and the knowledge. Fire, more than anything else, is the ideal tool for cleaning up evidence. And it is precisely the era of mass fires that coincides with the period when, according to our version, the empty cities were being settled. Look at the string of accidental fires in the 19th century. Moscow, 1812. We are told the city burned at the hands of the French or Russian patriots, but why did a city consisting of stone and brick buildings burn down? Ordinary fire does not reduce stone to ash. However, evidence suggests that granite and brick crumbled into sand in many places, which is a sign of exposure to incredibly high temperatures that ordinary flame cannot create. Chicago, 1871. San Francisco, 1906. These fires also destroyed cities that were mostly stone, and each time after the fire, the burned-out quarters were cleared with incredible speed to build new but less perfect buildings in their place. These fires could have been a deliberate cleansing of the territory, the destruction of the remnants of high-tech structures that could not be restored or were not meant to fall into the hands of the occupants. Simultaneously, the destruction of knowledge and archives was taking place. Famous libraries, such as the Library of Alexandria or numerous local archives, burned, and maps of the Old World depicting continents with completely different outlines were seized and redrawn. The history of civilization was literally being burned away. The goal was one. The new generations of orphans should not be left with a single physical proof that the world before them was different and more advanced. The cynical spectacle, the myth of the world's fairs. If something cannot be destroyed, it must be ridiculed and presented as fantasy. It was for this purpose that a grandiose hoax was invented in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the world's fairs, Paris, Chicago, St. Louis. We are told that in just a year or even a few months, engineers and workers erected colossal, incredibly beautiful ancient cities from light, perishable materials, plaster, wood, and straw. These pavilions allegedly imitated antiquity, and after the fair closed, they were blown up and leveled to the ground. Think about this cynical spectacle. A nation spends colossal sums, builds majestic palaces, huge sculptures, and perfect squares, only to show them for a few months and then completely destroy them. What is the economic and logical rationale for this? The truth may be different.
These pavilions were not new constructions, but unearthed quarters of the ancient civilization buried by the catastrophe. The occupants, needing to legitimize their power in new history, used the world's fairs as a smokescreen. They dug up fragments of ancient cities, cleaned them, and displayed them to the crowd as temporary pavilions or architectural fantasies. Why did they have to be destroyed? Because these structures were too perfect. They showcased technologies that could not be explained by the age of steam. Wireless electricity, which we see in the numerous Tesla towers and domes, moving sidewalks, complex acoustics, and perfect ventilation. They could not be left standing, as this would immediately raise questions among the occupants. If we can build this out of plaster in a year, why are we living in dirty, inconvenient brick boxes? Therefore, after closing, under the pretext of the end of the celebration, these palaces were blown up and the debris was dumped into reservoirs, creating new embankments and erasing the last traces of a highly developed civilization. The result? The spiral of degradation. The history they sold us is a fairy tale of progress, from the oil lamp to the light bulb, from the horse-drawn carriage to the steam engine. But if we look at the facts, at palaces without sanitary facilities, at buried cities, at logistical failures, at perfect pipes, and at the destroyed masterpieces of the exhibitions, it becomes clear we are moving not along the path of development, but along a spiral of degradation. We are barbarians who have occupied the ruins. And until we realize that our cities are not our achievements, but the tombstones of a great lost civilization, we will continue to use a microscope to hammer nails. The stones cry out that we are strangers here. Realize it. History comes alive when it's told. Subscribe. Discover what you've never heard before.